The purpose of the fulfillment of a prophecy is not to write down everything that will happen. The purpose of a prophecy is to write down enough of what is known about the future event to allow pattern recognition to occur. To see where you are standing in relation to the trajectory of the past development. To see if you are still on track with what its ancestors envisioned their positions, practices, policies, or values to be in the future. How their descendants will be viewed or treated by future geopolitical, religious, or economic conditions. These are all questions that are answered by pattern recognition produced in prophecy. Pattern recognition is primarily a term used in programming to create artificial intelligence algorithms. But it is also a term that originally comes from a cognitive process in nature. You see examples of pattern recognition in nature, illustrating that survival itself depends on a species successfully identifying pattern recognition. The following are 4 examples of how pattern recognition occurs in nature, and their benefit to a species, if done. Predator detection. Prey animals often have developed keen pattern recognition abilities to detect potential predators. Birds, for example, can recognize the silhouettes and flight patterns of raptors, allowing them to take evasive action. If they fail to successfully identify those patterns, they will become some raptor's dinner. Raptors are the collective term used to refer to birds of prey that often feed on other birds. Food identification. Animals also use pattern recognition to identify food sources. Bees recognize specific patterns of colors and shapes on flowers that signal the presence of nectar, guiding them to the right plants for sustenance. If they fail in their ability to do successful pattern recognition as a bee, they will starve to death. Navigation and migration. Animals like birds, insects, and sea turtles often use visual patterns in the landscape, celestial bodies, and Earth's magnetic field to navigate during migrations. These patterns help them find their way across vast distances. If they fail in their ability to successfully identify these patterns, they will become disoriented and die. Learning and memory. Many animals, including humans, use pattern recognition for learning and memory. Recognizing patterns in their environment helps them remember locations of food sources, water, and safe shelters. If an animal cannot remember the source and location of food sources by successfully identifying pattern recognition, they will not be able to find food and will starve to death. These examples showcase how pattern recognition is deeply ingrained in the survival strategies of various species. It allows organisms to make informed decisions, respond quickly to changing situations, and adapt to their environment for increased chances of survival and reproductive success. If you are a species that cannot successfully conduct pattern recognition, then you as a species are doomed to extinction. But this principle not only exists in nature, it is used in human psychology as well. According to Cognitive Psychology, a Student's Handbook, by Michael Isaac and Mark Keene, quote, "In psychology and cognitive neuroscience, the term pattern recognition describes a cognitive process that matches information from a stimulus with information retrieved from memory. Pattern recognition allows us to read words, understand language, recognize friends, and even appreciate music." End quote. According to artificial intelligence itself, pattern recognition is also how we discover that a prophecy has been fulfilled. Quote, "When events unfold in a way that aligns with the predictions of a prophecy, people recognize patterns between the prophecy and the events, leading to a sense of fulfillment." End quote. In prophecy, pattern recognition is also used for survival. Many of the topics involving prophecy, just like in nature, are actually pattern recognitions to assist in survival. That is how it was even used among the ancient Jews to survive the multiple hostile Gentile empires that wanted their complete extinction. And also, how John used these prophecies in the book of Revelation for spiritual Jews of the New Covenant. But the Roman Empire realized along the way that if you sabotage the pattern recognition, if you distort the prophecy enough through language, it will become completely unrecognizable and lose any value for survival. That is what counter-reformationists are intentionally counting on. Thus why the extreme fantastical distortions that they routinely engage in. It is a form of religious or spiritual sabotage. It has propaganda value in keeping these prophecies successfully distorted beyond any recognition. But by doing that, they also reveal the posture that they themselves have taken to be the actual enemy that those very prophecies have described. In the case of prophecies in Revelation, they are the Antichrist mentioned by John, whom he also originally called the Nicolaitans. But this secret is also the very secret they have been counting on their devotees and collaborators to keep. Thus why they never permit their audiences to ever be informed about who they are, despite the fact they already know this. As revealed and virtually confessed in Catherine of Siena's confession that such a recognition should not matter. Quote, "Even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom." End quote. So, as we have already pointed out to Counter-Reformation futurists, if there are no present Nicolaitans, then there is no future Antichrist. Because John directly connects the two, implicitly in his texts, when prophesying about them. Why have the four saucer judgments already happened? Because the Nicolaitans did not pass away, and the Antichrist, of whom is chief of Nicolaitans, is already present in the earth. If there are no Nicolaitans, then there is no Antichrist. Four saucer judgments. But if there are four saucer judgments, then there are Nicolaitans, and their Antichrist is already here. There is a binary reality presented in the fulfillment of those prophecies. It is an either-or proposition. Thus why the prophecies have to be distorted beyond any recognition. Theologians, preachers, priests, television evangelists, religious leaders, government officials, academic sources, and corporate sponsors, all the way down to individual zealots, all contribute. Some intentionally and consciously, and others unintentionally and unconsciously, to the propaganda work of sabotage, all conducted in order to prevent the simple act of pattern recognition. If you recognize the pattern, then they have lost the war. It's really just that simple. Their war is on the truth. If you recognize it, then they have lost. Despite everything they have done, all the money and the power on earth to accomplish their deception, to the tune of billions of dollars, and the power of globally dominant governments and institutions, all the wealth and power and knowledge of the entire global empire suddenly goes up in flames. Everything they have worked tirelessly for centuries, goes up in flames in a simple prophetic pattern recognition in less than a moment of time. And thus why there is so much propaganda effort and expense expended on revelation. That is where all the religions of the world lose their war against humanity. And make no mistake about it, that is precisely who they are fighting this war against. They are fighting this propaganda war against you. If you watch this series, you should be amply armed to make an accurate pattern recognition about what is a genuine prophetic event from what is sabotage and disinformation, and who is conducting it, and why they are motivated to do it. Can you use pattern recognition from the scriptures to see who the saboteurs and disinformationists really are? This is what Paul said about them in Ephesians chapter 4 verse 14, quote, "That we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men, and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive." End quote. Rome and its Nicolaitans were doing this as far back as when Paul wrote this letter to the Ephesians. And they have never stopped since. In the previous video, you saw that the prophecies of Armageddon had previously been around since the Reformation, almost 460 years ago. And the historicist prophecies of Armageddon never included the fantastical explanations that became a standard part of the Jesuit Counter-Reformation rapturism promoted by C.I. Scofield and his associates or students, like Hale Lindsey and Tim LaHaye. And unlike the version of the never-ending predictions of the rapturists that never happened, the version of the historicist prophecies actually occurred, which the rapturists quickly associated themselves with, in order to garner to themselves a credibility in Christianity they never earned, or had the right to. But that never stopped them from also producing never-ending book fictions and Hollywood movies, dramatizing the complete fiction and magical fantasies, all the way into our present era. There is, however, despite this notable event in historicist prophecy, a remaining mystery, left in the text in Revelation 16. While it is clear that the author intended to indicate the sequence of the Armageddon event would be unexpected, what would not be expected or apparent, is how the sixth saucer, also known as the bowl, judgment, would be fulfilled, after the already occurred Armageddon event. Because as it states in the English KJV text, from Revelation 16, verse 12, quote, "And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates. And the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." End quote. It clearly makes this preceding text seem to suggest that the armies would have to come across the Euphrates to the battle, and that would be prepared for the battle by having the river Euphrates dried up, so it could be easily traversed. The problem with that explanation is that since the Battle of Armageddon is actually fought before this event, then what is the point of this event? What does it mean? Why is it there in the timeline, after the Battle of Armageddon? There will be an amazing prophecy in the Textus Receptus, waiting to be discovered by you, in verse 12, and that is what you are going to find out, soon. And it makes complete sense, even in the chronology's sequence, of the historical timeline. It is not just a prophecy about the river drying up, it is a much larger prophecy about historical events, than simply that. And you will see that, as well. But before we get to that amazing discovery, in the sixth saucer judgment, dealing with the Euphrates River, we will have to resume, with the fifth saucer judgment, described as the plague of darkness, on the throne of the beast, which we will examine first. The fifth saucer judgment in Revelation chapter 16, verses 10 and 11, from a reconstructed translation of the Textus Receptus, reads as follows, quote, "And the fifth messenger poured out his saucer upon the throne of the beast. And his kingdom was obscured. And they chewed their tongues from toil. And they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their toil and their ulcer sores, but would not change their mind from their work." In verse 10, as we pointed out in our reconstructed text, the word is messenger not angel, saucer not vial or bowl, and throne not seat. And then in verse 11, we noted, the word toil is actually used in the text, not pain, indicating a hardship, instead of pain. And we noted in verse 11, John says despite this, they would not change their mind from their work, which is their occupation, not the KJV term, deed, as a single generic action. John is connecting the skin sores mentioned in verse 2, coming from taking the mark of the beast, and kissing his icon. The work they are doing is connected to this occupation. Something is coming that will create a hardship. And the expression of gnawing their tongues was a Greek expression of poverty or hardship, used to describe having nothing left but to chew on their own tongue for dinner. It did not actually mean to chew on their tongues because of pain, even though that became an often quoted biblical expression. It doesn't really make sense to chew on your tongue because of pain, because chewing your tongue actually causes pain. But it does make sense to see how it would become an expression for lack, to say, you had nothing to chew, but your own tongue. So what is this coming hardship, and why is it poured out on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom? We will examine that next. The fifth saucer judgment is the plague of darkness, on the Antichrist. As noted in earlier videos, the deity of the Antichrist is said to be Apollyon, or Apollo, the Roman sun god, born on December 25th, in Revelation chapter 9 verse 11. But we are told this deity will take the form of 3 unclean spirits, as frogs from Egypt, which will be devils which go out to the kings of the empire, and which will work miracles, to deceive their people, and seduce them into the worship of devils. We have amply previously covered how accurate this prophecy was, historically, as Rome's doctrine of the Trinity was taken from the Desert Fathers in Egypt, and originally called the trimale spirit of Ogdoads, from the Gospel of the Egyptians. Ogdoads were Egyptian creation spirits associated with the Nile, and were depicted as frogs. Exactly, as John had indicated in his prophecy. and, as was attested to, by both theological sources and secular historians. And also thus, John's reference to them from Hebrew history. And the memorable plague of frogs that visited Egypt, as the rebuke of their worship as creators and deities. But as you will see, this will not be John's only reference to the plagues of Egypt and his continuing rebuke of Rome's sun worship in Revelation chapter 16. Which, as previously noted, is also esoterically known as Lucifer, as a form of alleged enlightenment once realized, which, according to multiple prophecies in the New Testament, were known among the Jewish authors as the Great Delusion, the worship of devils, and a false Christ. The prophecy of the fourth saucer judgment, which began in 1911, causes the sun to produce unbearable heat and fires, so that it scorches the earth. But, in contrast to the fourth plague, which was the heat of the sun, raging out of control to produce heat and fires, that scorched the earth. In the fifth prophecy about the sun, light is extinguished, and there is great hardship or toil, as a result of the light that is extinguished, as a demonstration of God against that very same Lucifer, in the form of the coming plague. If we dig into this prophecy a little deeper, we discover John was taking this pattern from the Exodus plague of darkness sent against Pharaoh, who also was a worshipper of the sun. This event is reported in Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 through 23. Quote, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch out thine hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven. And there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt, 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings." End quote. This phenomena was believed by rabbinical commentators to have been a reference to the Egyptian Shamsin. The term Kamsin, Shamsin or Hamsin, in Arabic, Amsin, means 50. The term is more commonly known in Egypt as Kamasin. The Kamasin is a dry, hot, sandy local wind affecting Egypt and the Levant. There are historic connections to this phenomena in Egypt. Thick dust known to have covered areas during a Khamsin, effectively blocking out the sun for days, was known to have occurred. But the way that it happened was thought to be so unusual by Pharaoh that he was willing to consider letting the Hebrew slaves go as a result of its extreme and unusual form or effect. Muslims in Egypt calculate the period of Khamsin to commence on the day immediately following the Coptic festival of Easter Sunday, and to terminate on the day of Pentecost, an interval of 49 days. This period also roughly coincides with the Jewish counting of the Omer, which also lasts for an interval of 49 days between the springtime feasts of Pesach or Passover and Shavuot, as well as the Christian Eastertide, which the Coptic Christians also refer to as Khamsin. So there are deep historical connections in all these things, down to even the calculation of calendar days, feasts and observances from tradition, that indicate historically it was believed that the darkness that came upon Egypt was an extremely anomalous occurrence of the Egyptian phenomena, known in Hebrew as the Shamsin. The darkness, or effect of the dust cloud, was said to be so thorough that no one left their homes for 3 days. And then, the detail is added that in homes throughout Egypt, they also had no light. But light was seen burning in the Israelite homes. Most rabbinical commentators take that to be a symbolism, and not literal. But the language is literal. And there is an explanation from archaeology for that distinction in the difference in customs that existed between Egyptian household lighting and the Hebrew slave lighting commonly used. The wealthier and more privileged classes among the ancient Egyptians had access to lighting options not available to Hebrew slaves. Egyptian lamps would have been fueled by the more expensive olive oil, and might have had wicks made from plant fibers. The lighting options for slaves would have been basic and utilitarian. They used simple clay lamps, and the fuels used for these lamps would have been whatever was readily available and cost-effective, most probably the use of tallow, which is made from the fat of dead animals. While tallow would have been considered the cheaper product used by slaves. Tallow is actually known to burn hotter than olive oil, because olive oil is plant-based material. The combination of higher than normal wind speeds and thick dust saturation might have been problematic for lamps lit by olive oil with plant wicks versus the cheaper use of tallow. The 10 plagues of Egypt were not directly repeated in Revelation, where the judgments are found in 3 sets of 7. But they are directly echoed in allusions to their earlier occurrence. The appearance of water like blood also occurred in the Nile during the 10 plagues. We know from the 6th saucer judgment, which prophesies that the Euphrates River will dry up, that the event horizon for this prophecy can now be seen empirically. It is no longer a question of if it will happen, but when. And most climate scientists now warn if drastic actions are not taken, the Euphrates River will dry up as soon as the year 2040, or in other words, about 20 years from now. This obviously would not be happening if there were no Antichrist in the earth. Because this is another judgment against the Antichrist. And we were able to astronomically date the 6th saucer to the year 2052. Meaning the Euphrates River has an additional 12 years from what is being currently predicted. But the scientific estimates are pretty close to the same range as the prophecy. So that means that whatever the 5th saucer judgment is, it will occur between 1911 and 2052. That is a span of about 140 years. The event that took place in Egypt only lasted for 3 days, but it was extreme enough that it was said to scare Pharaoh into a temporary decision to release the Hebrew slaves. And despite the assumed amount of dust that would have blanketed the land of Egypt with darkness, it was the darkness, not the dust, which frightened Pharaoh the most. The significance of that might have been due to the fact that Pharaoh was a sun worshipper. This is where the Hebrew designation of Abaddon, which was used by John in Revelation chapter 9, verse 11, historically came from. The plague was not the dust, but the absence of light, which struck fear into the heart and mind of Pharaoh. It demonstrated that there was something seriously wrong with his conception of what is really God and his alleged enlightenment by the Egyptian sun gods. So too will be the divine rebuke from heaven coming for the modern worshippers of Rome's 3 unclean spirits and their deity in the form of Lucifer, born on December 25th. Like Pharaoh, rather than being enlightened, they will become plagued with darkness. Counter-Reformation propagandists are caught between a rock and a hard place. That is the binary choice forced upon them to either admit the saucer judgments are already here and thus repent of their doctrines of delusion, or deny they are here at all and become more and more unprepared to deal with their deadly consequences. We already know from prophecy which choice they will make. But in making that choice, they will render all their followers completely unprepared for what is coming. And as a consequence, many will not survive, just as was seen in the previous denial of the COVID pandemic. COVID comes from the coronavirus. The word corona comes from the term that refers to the halo of the sun, often shown in depiction of Catholic saints. It is a sun plague. Those whose theology demanded denial rather than repentance often ended up dead, to the tune of an excess of at least 6.9 million people, according to worldometerinformation.com, which lists the global casualties in 2023 by country and tallies them up on its website. The incessant denial of reality, including denial about coronavirus pandemic, which afflicts counter-reformationist ministers who hold to Jesuit rapture eschatology, is a phenomena that is reported on the website ChristmasIsALie.com, and its connection between counter-reformation theology and pandemic denial is graphically illustrated in A Wall of Dead Preachers. The link to the Wall of Dead Preachers will be provided in the description section below. Another dramatic episode of denial is fast approaching on the prophetic clock. And this plague will potentially have the same kind of deadly consequences for people who prefer denial, medieval fantasies and conspiracy theories instead of the truth. And this reality will be illustrated in this video for you. The 4th saucer judgment is the last one, which counter-reformation liars and deceivers are still denying is even happening. They are offering instead patently absurd conspiracy theories that the government is secretly controlling the weather, or that it is just the natural effect of the sun, just like they tried to claim red tide in Florida was just the natural effect of the ocean. Counter-Reformationists have a consistent track record of openly lying and fabricating to deny reality, in order to hold on to their Jesuit-inspired, medieval superstitions, derived from Counter-Reformation eschatology. But the effect of their delusion is to leave millions of people intentionally unprepared and unaware of what is happening around them, that they can actually see with their very own eyes. According to the prophetic clock, we know that the window of the plague of darkness exists between the fourth saucer judgment and the sixth saucer judgment. That is a span of 140 years. But moving forward from today to the sixth saucer judgment, the current window for the plague of darkness is now only 29 years, assuming that the previous chronology is resumed after the historical occurrence of Armageddon in 1918. And there is no reason to assume that it isn't. Armageddon was intentionally described as coming as a surprise in the text, indicating it would not be chronological or sequential with what John was writing. But he resumes after the anomalous prophetic event of Armageddon, back to the seven saucer judgments, in sequential order. There are 29 years between the present day in 2023 and the sixth saucer judgment in 2052, when the Euphrates River will be dried. That means sometime between now and 2052, the plague of darkness will occur. That could be any time between now and then. But we will try to get more precise with what is coming and when it might occur in this video. As shown earlier, John's prophecies were era-long epics of history. And the plague of darkness will be the challenge of a generation, as big as the world wars, the pandemics, terrorism, and all the other events depicted by John in the book of Revelation. And we are told by John that the stars are the messengers to the ecclesia. It is the same kind of pattern recognition that occurs in animals in nature, who also make use of celestial bodies and markers to know the seasons and how to navigate their migrations. If you remain in denial about what is coming, and you refuse to acknowledge the Antichrist is here, and there will be no magical rapture to bail you out of it, it will come upon you completely unprepared, and it may be an event that you do not survive. But if you repent and prepare, you will be like the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, who had light when their Egyptian neighbors did not. There will be nothing to fear or be afraid of, because you, as the bride of Christ, have made yourself ready. We know that the current window is the next 29 years. But before we begin to pinpoint when this event might happen, we must first explore what could be the cause. And we get those clues from the reconstructed Textus Receptus text itself. The last part of the text is key. It reads as follows, quote, "And they chewed their tongues from toil. And they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their toil and their sores, but would not change their mind from their work." End quote. In the first part, "they chewed their tongues from toil," is the first consideration. As covered previously, this was an idiomatic expression to mean a lack of basic necessity. So the kind of darkness, or the cause of the darkness, that is going to occur, is going to be disruptive. This did not happen in Egypt. While the darkness was fearful and scary, because it was so unusual, it was not disruptive in that sense. It was disruptive because of the darkness, but the darkness there only occurred over a span of 3 days. It did not cause lack, or pain from poverty or hardship. What is coming in the next 29 years will cause a lack of basic necessity, or hardship. The second clue is the second part, where he connects the reaction of the people to blaspheming God because of their sores. Because we now know what those sores actually are, we could get a much clearer picture as to why they would be moved to blaspheme God as a result of the plague of darkness and its resultant disruption. Because it will be especially problematic for people with those kinds of sores. They could potentially be facing a death sentence. So, from the text, it appears to distinguish the fifth saucer judgment from the Egyptian plague of darkness in that the results are going to be much more dramatic. However, unlike the Egyptian plague, there will be little or no repentance, even if temporary only. The will to persist in error, despite its obvious rebuke from heaven itself, among counter-reformationists, will be overwhelming and irrational. But it will serve as an undeniable witness to everyone else, of their error. When we query events that could lead to large regional or international darkness, these are the candidate events that are realistic potentials for the fifth saucer judgment, which is the plague of darkness. These scenarios are prioritized by the artificial intelligence program GPT-Chat 3.5. From the most likely scenario to the least likely, in order. The most likely cause to create darkness, ranked at number 1, is extreme volcanic activity. Volcanic events can lead to what is called a volcanic winter, wherein the ash and aerosols ejected into the atmosphere can block sunlight for an extended period. This can cause significant cooling, disrupt agricultural production, affect ecosystems, and have societal implications beyond a temporary inconvenience. The Guardian reported that a volcanic winter actually occurred in April 1815, and it was the biggest known eruption of the historical period, which blew apart the Tambora volcano on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa, 12,000 kilometers from the UK. Even though it was 12,000 kilometers from Europe, its consequence was epic. Quote, for the less well-to-do of Europe, however, the Tambora eruption brought nothing less than hunger, disease and death. Widespread harvest failure resulted in the most serious famine for more than 100 years, doubling the price of grain and spawning bread riots and widespread civil unrest. Such was the degree of breakdown of food supply, that economic historian John Post has called the episode, the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world. One estimate holds that there is a 1 in 10 chance of a comparable event in the next 50 years. End quote. The second most probable cause as ranked by artificial intelligence is a solar storm, Carrington scale event. A solar storm on the scale of the Carrington event has the potential to cause significant disruptions to the electrical grid within a continental region. The Carrington event, which occurred in 1859, was one of the most powerful solar storms ever recorded. It involved a massive coronal mass ejection, abbreviated by the letters CME, from the Sun, which released a tremendous amount of energy and sent a barrage of charged particles toward Earth. If a similar solar storm were to happen today, it could induce powerful geomagnetic currents in the Earth's atmosphere and ground, particularly in regions with extensive power grid infrastructure. The problem arises from the interaction of these geomagnetic currents with the power grid's conductive elements, such as power lines, transformers, and other electrical equipment. The following events would occur. 1. Transformer damage. 2. Grid instability and cascading failures. 3. Communication disruptions. 4. GPS and satellite disruption. 5. Agricultural and economic impacts. Although artificial intelligence ranked a volcanic winter as more probable scenario of the two, Reuters reports that a Carrington scale event is 12% likely over the next decade, which is 2% more probable than the volcanic winter scenario. But neither scenario is actually likely. Except for the fact, there is a prophecy from 2,000 years ago that predicted in the next 29 years. Since these are the top two candidates, the other possibilities also mentioned were 3. A nuclear winter, caused by thermonuclear war. But the war itself would be more of an item of the prophecy than its attending darkness. Darkness would be the last of your problems in that scenario. In this text, such a reference to a war is not even mentioned in the prophecy. 4. Asteroid impact. While this is possible, such an asteroid impact, large enough to cover such a region, would be extinction level, and certainly would have been again the focus of the actual prophecy, which it is not. And rounding out the top 5 is an EMP warfare attack. EMP stands for an electromagnetic pulse weapon. They are not sophisticated enough yet to render an entire continental region without power, and once again the conflict would have been prominently featured in the prophecy. So we are looking at either a volcanic winter, or a solar coronal mass ejection known as a Carrington event, within the next 29 years. Both of which are dramatically unusual, but natural, events, like the Egyptian Judgement, wind, that was seen in the Exodus, during the time of Moses. But which is it? We have two, roughly equal possible events, but both equally unlikely. But if you have to choose between the two, which event best matches the description given by John? Textually, the best match is the solar coronal mass ejection. Because the saucer judgments are all against Rome's sun worship. And all of the previous judgments in Revelation 16 that have taken place were sun-related, divine judgments. So let's explore that scenario a little deeper, and what you should do to prepare for what is coming. As mentioned in the previous section, the most probable events for the fifth saucer judgment ranked in order according to artificial intelligence is 1. A volcanic winter, 2. A coronal mass ejection from the sun, 3. Nuclear winter, 4. An asteroid impact, and 5. An EMP attack. But of these 5 scenarios, there is only one that is a sun-based phenomena, and the previous 4 judgments were also all sun-based phenomena. The skin sores, caused by the sun. Red tide, exasperated by global warming, from the sun. Freshwater toxic algae bloom, exasperated by global warming, from the sun. Heat and fire, caused by global warming, from the sun. And a coronal mass ejection, which would also be caused by the sun. That is the only scenario that also falls into the pattern of the saucer judgments brought against modern Roman sun worship, December 25th. And also known as Lucifer and his trinity of 3 unclean frog spirits. And believe it or not, this scenario is probably by far the best case scenario for the plague of darkness. Volcano winter had century-long impacts. Nuclear winter would be extinction level, as would asteroid impact. EMP attack would be similar in effect but would be only local to a metropolitan area. And the problem with all these other scenarios, textually, is that these events would have features which make them much more significant prophetically, and thus would feature much more prominently in the actual prophecy. Why would John prophesy darkness, when what would cause the darkness would be a much bigger event, making the state of darkness almost an insignificant point? However, the only thing mentioned in the prophecy is the resultant effect of darkness. And this exclusive feature of only its effect is what distinguishes scenario number 2 as the most likely pattern match for the prophecy in Revelation 16, which is precisely what it would produce. If you are a survivor of a nuclear winter, for example, why would you even bother to complain about the darkness? Of course it's dark. But, in the text, it is a darkness that is not supposed to be. There is no other event described other than the darkness. Thus why, in the text, that is its prominent feature. In this section, we will try to narrow down when this event might come. But regardless of how inaccurate or accurate this dating effort may be, one thing is probable, given the prophecy being intentionally hidden from the public. In Revelation 16, it is more likely than not, it is already fully known and being anticipated that this event is coming within the next 3 decades. You are not the only person who will know and be fully aware of this information. Every minister who can read a Bible, no matter how obtuse or dumb they may be, can see that the 6th bowl judgment is without question or debate the drying of the Euphrates River. This is the one prophetic sign that absolutely no one can miss. Not even Muslims miss the significance of the drying of the Euphrates River. It's as plain and clear and in broad daylight as any prophetic sign can possibly be. You can't really lie yourself into thinking it is not there, or that it is just a conspiracy, or that scientists are lying about it. You can claim it is caused by humans, but even with that, it still exists and is prophetically historic in its nature. No matter what the cause, it is what it is. And because the 6th saucer judgment is now coming up on the event horizon, and can be empirically seen, that also means the 5th saucer judgment will soon proceed within the time frame window of the remaining 29 years. And it also means no honest pastor, even if they are premillennial Jesuit rapturists, can deny, therefore the Antichrist must already be present in the world. After the completion of the 29 years, premillennialists will have completely run out of time on all their excuse-making. And at that point, they will either admit they have been serving that very same Antichrist, or they will repent. But 29 years is a long way away. Before that landmark prophecy is completed, they will have the opportunity to exercise the next cover story, to hide the 5th saucer judgment for the Antichrist that they ever faithfully serve. They will drag out on parade and simply repeat all their hit excuses. That's not it. A science conspiracy lied about it. It didn't happen. Governments were manipulating society. It's the Great Reset. Blah blah blah, yada yada yada, on it will go. And they will have 29 years to lie about what the truth is, who's at fault, what really happened other than what did, etc., etc. But every Christian that makes the mistake of believing in their continued lies will be further immersed into the great delusion. Because God is going to be the one who is going to do it. It is called the fifth saucer judgment, and it was prophesied in Revelation 16, just as much as was melanoma from the sun, red tide, global warming, and the drying up of the Euphrates River. Everyone that is currently watching this video will be forewarned about what is going to happen, why it is going to happen, and we will make the very best effort to narrow down when it's going to happen, and what to do to be prepared for this event. Which you will never get from preachers who promote Jesuit futurism's eschatology that can't even tell you who the Antichrist even is. Much less what is Armageddon, or water to blood, or the skin sores, or the mark of the beast. Which actually think, or thought before they died, it was a vaccination. There are not as many of them left in the earth now, for precisely that reason. Because they believe their own propaganda. In the following section in this video, we are going to tell you how you can know when it is coming. There will be a relatively small window of time that you will need to be prepared for a disruption of service. During the previous Carrington event, in 1859, the coronal mass ejection occurred, during what is known as a solar maximum cycle. The sun goes through 11-year cycles. During these cycles, there are phases where solar activity, such as sunspots and coronal ejections, peak. These periods are called solar maximums. Each of the solar cycles are numbered by astronomers and space weather scientists to refer to them. And it was during one of these very phases, specifically solar cycle number 10, that the Carrington event occurred. When plotting the most probable occurrence of such an event, it is helpful to know when these maximum phases occur, and when they diminish into what are called solar minimums. Coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, can occur at any point during the solar cycle, but they are more common and tend to be more frequent during the peak of the solar cycle. Solar cycles, which last approximately 11 years, go through periods of increased solar activity known as solar maximum and periods of decreased activity known as solar minimum. During solar maximum, when the number of sunspots and solar flares is higher, the likelihood of CMEs also increases. This is because CMEs are often associated with solar flares and regions of intense magnetic activity on the sun's surface. Solar flares are more frequent during the active phase of the solar cycle, contributing to a higher occurrence of CMEs. It's important to note that while CMEs are more common during solar maximum, they can still occur during the declining phase of the solar cycle post-maximum and even during solar minimum. The frequency of ejections depends on the phase of the solar cycle, from about 0.2 per day, near the solar minimum, to 3.5 per day, near the solar maximum. However, the peak CME occurrence rate is often 6 to 12 months after the sunspot number reaches its maximum. The schedule of solar cycles over the next 30 years, between now and 2052, which is the date for the sixth saucer judgment, are solar cycle 25, solar cycle 26, and solar cycle 27. Those three cycles are shown on your screen, with a line graph, and the approximate dates on the historical timeline, with each cycle's peak and minimum activity. Long-range space weather predictions are complicated and difficult, and are often frequently revised by unforeseen spontaneous conditions as they occur. So when you hear someone tell you that a Carrington scale event will not occur because of those predictions, you need to be aware that according to the same scientists that make those predictions, they always preface their reports with disclaimers to that very effect. That space weather prediction is complex and always subject to conditions as they occur. In the three solar cycles, from solar cycle 25, solar cycle 26, and solar cycle 27, we know that the time frame for the fifth saucer judgment, in all probability, would have to come within the time frame of these three cycles. We are already into the first solar cycle 25. And the window for its occurrence expires in the 27th cycle. When we look at the 3 remaining solar cycles, the areas of most probability occurs during the 3 remaining solar maximums. Those are the years for the first cycle, between 2024 through 2028. For the second cycle, the years between 2034 through 2039. And for the third cycle, the years between 2045 through 2050. As John stated in the beginning of the book of Revelation, the 7 stars are the messengers to the 7 ecclesia. The 7 ecclesia were the ecclesia communities of the 7 cities, to whom he wrote. The word church does not appear in the Textus Receptus, and the word ecclesia, which is intentionally mistranslated as the word church, was used in the Greek Old Testament Septuagint for the company of prophets. When you look at the messengers of the 7 saucer judgments, which are said to be the 7 stars, that was how the ancient world referred to the 7 planets, which we covered in previous videos. In the 7 saucer judgments, each prophecy, astronomically, featured a different planet, and the planet which marks the coming of the plague of darkness, in the 7 judgments, is the planet Jupiter, which is known in Hebrew as the messenger Zadek, which means justice. The saucer judgments all illustrate the act of pouring out from the constellation of Aquarius, which was actually pictured pouring out, thus the visual symbolism of pouring. The astronomical signs in the heavens feature the black moon in the pouring out action, the sun in Aquarius, with the messenger Zadek, or Jupiter, are all featured as signs in the heavens, along with the presence of Venus. This astronomical sign in the heavens occurs on February 19th, in the year 2034. This astronomical sign occurs in the early part of solar cycle 26. But because it is still prophetic, we have no idea how precise that sign will be to the event. We don't know if the sign is given early, to give people time to prepare, or if it is an exact date. If we understand the sign as accurate to the decade, then it could occur in any of the remaining 3 solar cycles, most likely and specifically, the years for the first cycle, between 2024 through 2028. For the second cycle, the years between 2034 through 2039. And for the third cycle, the years between 2045 through 2050. We have also been given intuitive information that there may be a birth pang for this event, as early as February of 2024. And if we cruise past solar cycle 26, then we would expect a delayed event to occur in February of 2045. But given the totality of the available evidence, the sign occurs on February 19, 2034, and that is where we expect the event to have what is called an event horizon. Or in other words, it will become visible as a possible real occurrence. That will give everyone who takes the historicist interpretation of prophecy and the presence of the Antichrist in the earth, plenty of time to consider what the event's effects will be, and how to adequately prepare for their coming, as has been prophesied. And, as in a direct echo of the 9th plague, as in the 10 plagues of Egypt, and as occurred in Egypt's plague of darkness, while even the light in the homes of Egypt failed, light in the homes of the Israelites were still seen burning. What you can do to prepare will be shown next. The Carrington event of 1859, also known as the 1859 solar superstorm, was named after Richard Carrington, the British astronomer who witnessed the event and reported seeing a white light flare on the sun's surface. The flare was so intense that it produced visible effects on Earth's magnetosphere and ionosphere. The coronal mass ejection, or CME, associated with the solar flare reached Earth in a remarkably short time, only about 17.6 hours after the solar flare was observed. This rapid onset contributed to the intense and sudden geomagnetic storm that followed. The geomagnetic storm caused by the Carrington event had a global impact. Auroras, northern and southern lights, were observed at latitudes as low as the Caribbean and Hawaii. Such widespread visibility of auroras at low latitudes is extremely rare, and indicates the intensity of the geomagnetic disturbance. The Carrington event is particularly noteworthy for its effects on telegraph systems. Telegraph operators experienced electric shocks, telegraph lines sparked, and paper caught fire due to induced currents in the wires. This marked one of the first instances of technology being significantly affected by space weather. Other than the disruption of telegraph services, there were virtually no other disruptions of life in that period of history. But that was before the age of electricity. An equivalent solar phenomena today would have drastic effects, even if successfully forecasted by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and which operates the Space Weather Prediction Center. For example, even if all electronic systems were completely shut down during an extreme space weather event, like the Carrington event, there would still be negative effects on electronic systems and critical infrastructure. The reason for this lies in the way severe space weather events interact with Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere, creating disturbances that can have wide-ranging impacts beyond electronic devices that are directly powered off. Some of the potential negative effects that could still occur, even with electronics powered down, include geomagnetically induced currents, also known as GICs. GICs can be induced in long conductive structures, such as power lines, pipelines, and railways, due to the changing magnetic fields during a geomagnetic storm. These GICs can cause damage to transformers and electrical components even when the main electrical systems are shut down. Satellite and communication disruptions. Geomagnetic storms can interfere with satellite communications and global positioning systems, also known as GPS. GPS systems, regardless of whether the satellites are operational or not, would still be affected. This disruption can impact various sectors, including navigation, communications, and weather forecasting. Spacecraft operations. Satellites in orbit are susceptible to space weather effects, including charging from incoming solar particles and increased drag from the Earth's expanded atmosphere during a geomagnetic storm. Shutting down spacecraft may protect them to some extent, but their operations could still be affected. Auroras and ionospheric disturbances. Severe space weather events can lead to stunning auroras, northern and southern lights visible at lower latitudes. These colorful displays can be captivating but also impact high-frequency radio communications and disturb the ionosphere. Power grid restoration challenges. Restoring the power grid after the storm passes may still present challenges, as engineers need to assess the impact on critical components and ensure that the system can be safely re-energized. A solar storm on the level of a Carrington event would be a global event. The Carrington event of 1859, which was one of the most powerful solar storms ever recorded, had widespread impacts across the globe. Similarly, a solar storm of similar magnitude today would have global consequences due to our modern technological society's interconnectedness and dependence on electronic systems. According to current computer models, if a geomagnetic superstorm were to occur, there are 4 possible scenarios which could affect the United States electrical grid. Those 4 scenarios depend on the latitude of impact into the Earth's atmosphere. 55 degrees plus or minus 2.75 degrees geomagnetic latitude, labeled S1, in the map. 50 degrees plus or minus 2.75 degrees geomagnetic latitude, labeled S2, in the map. 45 degrees plus or minus 2.75 degrees geomagnetic latitude, labeled S3, in the map. 50 degrees plus or minus 7.75 degrees geomagnetic latitude, labeled S4, in the map. As you can see from the worst-case scenario maps for the United States, there are a number of states that will not even be affected, ranging from 41 states in Scenario 1, which would affect the United States the very least, all the way to Scenario 4, which would impact the United States the most, resulting in 42 states with blackouts. But in all 4 scenarios, if you have ample time to intentionally plan evasive action, you can make plans to be in these 7 states, which would be from left to right: California, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. In every scenario, these 7 states remain in the clear. However, most being southern coastal states, they will have other issues to deal with, such as heat waves and disrupted global supply chains. But at least, the models determined, these states should have a working power grid intact. As things stand today, and if our current dating is correct, you will have more than an entire full decade to get ready for this event. So the first thing you should do is get in the right state of mind to anticipate what is coming, and also how to survive what will happen. For senior citizens, a full decade is probably beyond most life expectancies. You will probably be making plans for your children or grandchildren only. If you are a younger person, or are middle-aged, you should plan in terms of your future living arrangements, and consider the location. As you will be able to see, in the prophecy itself, John never prophesies the end of civilization. He prophesies only the toil of those who follow the beast, because of their denial, and that description might not even be extended farther than predominantly Western Europe. So a collapse of civilization will not happen. Secondly, you will also see that there will be severe inconvenience to those who have the skin sores from the first saucer judgment. That is basal cell carcinoma, or melanoma. Or in other words, a type of cancer. But the skin sore is just the physical manifestation of cancer as a class of disease. And sun exposure is the #1 cause of these types of cancer. This event will disrupt the supply chain of needed medications for skin cancer. And thus why John mentions it in his prophecy. But obviously, skin cancer patients will probably not be the only type of patient needs for medication will be affected. So it will be important to get as healthy as possible as the decade proceeds. You will not be able to rely on prescription medication. The elderly and the young will be the most vulnerable, as often happens in natural disasters, mostly due to the heat, which will be increasing nearly every year from here on out. It will be important to anticipate the unbearable heat with creative solutions that you can find naturally. Things like sleeping with open windows, with high-quality window screens, and battery-powered fans to manage the heat. If you live in a state that is vulnerable to a geostorm blackout, as the time passes, put yourself through some trial runs, where you turn off all the electricity, and pretend you have just gone through a natural disaster, and are left with no electricity. And find out what things will be a problem, and what things will not. Coastal states who have gone through hurricanes already know the drill. The dark, the heat, and the supply chain disruption that will occur. And how slow repairs often are. Solar and wind electricity are not a sufficient measure on their own. During a Carrington event or a severe solar storm, solar and wind systems could be affected also, potentially leading to disruptions or damage. Solar and wind systems, like other electronic and electrical infrastructure, are susceptible to the effects of geomagnetically induced currents, called GICs, which are induced by intense solar activity. In solar-powered systems, solar panels themselves are not directly affected by geomagnetic storms, as they convert sunlight into electricity through photovoltaic processes. However, solar power systems are connected to the electrical grid, which could experience GICs during a solar storm. GICs can flow through power lines and cause problems for various components of the grid, including transformers. If transformers in the power grid are damaged due to GICs, this could lead to power outages and affect the functionality of solar power systems connected to the grid. In wind-powered systems, wind turbines are generally less vulnerable to GICs than transformers, as they do not have the same type of conductive components. They have mechanical components that could be affected by strong winds or storms associated with solar activity, but this would not be specific to a solar storm. However, like solar power systems, wind power systems are also connected to the electrical grid and could experience disruptions if the grid infrastructure is affected by GICs. The extent of the impact on solar and wind systems during a Carrington event depends on various factors, including the intensity of the solar storm, the design and resilience of the specific solar and wind systems, and the condition of the electrical grid. To mitigate the potential effects of solar storms on power systems, including solar and wind, power grid operators and utility companies implement measures, such as grid hardening, use of surge protectors, and real-time monitoring of geomagnetic activity. Additionally, improvements in system design and technology can enhance the resilience of renewable energy systems to space weather events. The time frame for predicting CME impacts on Earth depends on several factors, including the speed of the CME and its direction. Generally, CMEs take around 1 to 4 days to reach Earth from the Sun, with an average travel speed of about 400 to 800 kilometers per second. So, if a particularly powerful CME is directed toward Earth, space weather agencies can provide advance warning of several days. Preparing for a global disruption caused by an extreme space weather event, such as a severe solar storm like the Carrington event, requires individuals to take proactive measures to ensure their safety and well-being. While it is challenging for individuals to shield against the full impact of such an event, the following steps can help improve their preparedness. 1. Stay informed. Stay informed about space weather forecasts and warnings issued by space weather monitoring agencies and authorities. These agencies provide updates on solar activity and potential space weather impacts. Follow their advice and take necessary precautions. 2. Emergency supplies. Have an emergency kit ready that includes essential supplies such as food, water, medications, flashlight, batteries, and a battery-powered radio. This kit can be helpful during prolonged disruptions. 3. Backup power and charging. Consider having backup power sources, such as portable generators or solar chargers, for electronic devices. These can be beneficial if electrical grids are disrupted. 4. Unplug sensitive devices. During a solar storm, it's a good idea to unplug sensitive electronic devices and appliances to protect them from potential power surges or induced currents. 5. Awareness of vulnerabilities. Be aware of potential vulnerabilities in your area, such as the reliance on technology and infrastructure. Understand how space weather can impact power grids, communication systems, and other essential services. 6. Communication plan. Have a communication plan in place with family members and loved ones, in case traditional communication channels are affected. Consider using alternative means, like satellite phones or walkie-talkies. 7. Stay calm and adaptable. In case of a global disruption, stay calm and be adaptable to changing circumstances. Having a resilient mindset and being prepared can help individuals and communities navigate challenging situations. The solar flare observed by Richard Carrington on August 28, 1859, lasted for only a few minutes. The subsequent CME took approximately 17.6 hours to travel from the Sun to Earth. The geomagnetic storm generated by the interaction of the CME with Earth's magnetosphere reached its peak on September 1 to 2, 1859. So, the entire duration of the Carrington event, from the solar flare to the peak of the geomagnetic storm, spanned only a few days. However, it's essential to recognize that the effects of the Carrington event were not limited to those few days. The consequences of such an extreme space weather event can persist for an extended period due to the impacts on technological infrastructure, such as power grids, communication systems, and satellites. Depending on the severity of the storm and the resilience of the affected infrastructure, the recovery process could take days, weeks, or even months. If you are anticipating residing in a potentially affected CME danger zone, realize that the event itself takes place for only a few days. It is the lack of preparation that will cause all the subsequent crises. If you are aware of the fifth bowl judgment, you will be prepared for what is coming, and like the ancient Israelites, light will be seen in your home, when worshippers of the sun will have only darkness. It says in the text in Revelation 16, verse 10, that the darkness is poured out on the throne of the beast. This is the prophetic reference to the papal throne in St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, the sovereign enclave of the Pope inside Rome, Italy. That geographical coordinates for this location is 41.9029 degrees N, 12.4534 degrees E. If this is intended by John to be a literal reference, that means the global latitude for the Carrington event will enter the Earth's atmosphere at approximately 42 degrees N. In the map of the United States, in which computer models were used to play out 4 scenarios of Carrington event scale blackouts, the computer model scenario for a 42 degrees N latitude angle means that scenario number 3, labeled S3, would be the most likely outcome. According to the website, space.com, in an article updated on June 24, 2022, quote, researchers from Lloyd's of London and the Atmospheric and Environmental Research Agency in the US have estimated that a Carrington-class event today would result in between $0.6 and $2.6 trillion in damages to the US alone, according to NASA spaceflight. End quote. In an article entitled, How a Massive Solar Storm Could Wipe Out Modern Technology, ScienceAlert.com. Reprinted an article, originally published on the website, Business Insider, from September 2016, stated quote, the best available estimates suggest, a modern Carrington event would cost humanity $1 trillion to $2 trillion in the first year, and take another 4 to 10 years to achieve full recovery. End quote. An Autobot generated by GPT Chat, for a question posted on Quora, how many fatalities would occur in a modern Carrington event, stated, quote, it is generally acknowledged that a severe solar storm of this magnitude could have severe impacts on our modern infrastructure, potentially leading to widespread power outages, disruptions to communications networks, and damage to satellite systems. These consequences could potentially result in significant loss of life, particularly if critical systems, such as those related to healthcare and emergency services, were affected. End quote. On the website, Think Big, on the article entitled, How Vulnerable is Earth to a Solar Flare? The author stated, quote, a Carrington magnitude event would kill millions and cause trillions of dollars in damage. Sadly, it isn't even the worst-case scenario. In the worst-case scenario, not only would this cause tens of trillions of dollars in property damage worldwide, but millions upon millions of people would freeze, starve, or die of dehydration in the aftermath of such a storm. End quote. Trillions of dollars in damage, and potentially millions of deaths. The vast majority of these deaths, however, would be avoidable and needless deaths. That is often the case after natural disasters. More people die in the aftermath of storms and hurricanes than in the actual storms and hurricanes. Deaths from natural disasters are mostly the tragic result of nothing more than simply being unprepared for what would happen without basic services. A combination of bad, unwise decisions and being unprepared to cope with the unpleasant aftermath of a disaster is actually the cause of most disaster-related deaths, not the actual disaster event. As amazing as that statistic is, stop and consider for just a moment the utter wickedness of men that would knowingly hide knowledge that the fifth saucer judgment was already on its way, and intentionally hide this information from the public behind a fully known, completely fictitious eschatology, allegedly from Revelation, thus rendering millions of followers completely unprepared and vulnerable to the most basic, yet deadly, elements of such a disaster, and possibly bearing the responsibility of the deaths of thousands, if not millions of people, who are in denial, and simply unprepared to deal with that reality. That is precisely what is in the process of happening today, thanks to America's faithless and despicable, counter-Reformation, religious leaders. There will be no rapture. There is an Antichrist. And the 7 saucer judgments are already fully and visibly underway in today's world. The 5th saucer judgment is already on its way in real history. It's just a question of how long these faithless counter-Reformation religious leaders will keep lying to the public for money, rather than serving their people with the knowledge of the truth instead. The very information that have been spiritually charged with, and will be held responsible for, by God, for not giving. In the next video, we will proceed to the 6th saucer judgment, which is the drying up of the Euphrates River, which is now estimated by some climate scientists to possibly happen as early as the year 2040. Thank you for watching.